Can you believe that the most powerful, sprawling, and fundamentally world-changing empires in history were created by people who never stayed in one place long enough to build a stone house? We are about to dive into the abyss, a 2 millennia-long cycle of catastrophe and conquest that completely erased established civilizations and reshaped continents faster than any recorded earthquake. This is the real, terrifying history that the textbooks whisper about. We are talking about a force so kinetic, so fundamentally devastating, that the settled world, from the glory of imperial Rome to the mandate of heaven in China, lived in perpetual, paralyzing fear of the sound of distant hooves on the horizon. They were the dark matter of history, the unseen gravity that kept every established power constantly looking over its shoulder, knowing that true doom didn't come from a neighboring king, but from the infinite, wind-swept emptiness of the Eurasian steppe. This is not a story you can afford to fall asleep to, despite the title's deceptive promise. This is the Sleep Chronicle, dedicated to the empires built on nothing but grass, speed, and the sheer, terrifying will to conquer the very air you breathe. And they did it while living almost entirely on horseback. For millennia, the steppe was not a barren wasteland. It was the heart of a chaotic, sprawling, and lethal kingdom, an ocean of tall grasses stretching without interruption from the modern borders of Hungary all the way to the Great Wall of China itself. It was a place where civilization died the moment you stepped off the road, where the only thing that mattered was survival and the speed of your horse. Imagine for a moment living in a walled city, believing in stability, in the rule of law, in the permanence of your stone foundation, and suddenly the entire northern horizon turns black, not with storm clouds, but with 200,000 horses ridden by spectral warriors who appeared yesterday from absolutely nowhere, and who will be gone tomorrow, leaving nothing but smoking, silent ruins behind them. This is the beginning of the great, tragic cycle of the nomad, a catastrophic pattern that defined 2,000 years of human experience, shattering established cultures and forcing the creation of the single greatest defensive structure ever conceived by man, the legendary Great Wall, which was itself often useless against the fury it was meant to contain. We begin our journey in the profound, swirling chaos of the Xiongnu, the very first empire of speed and terror, a civilization so effective at warfare that they forced the mighty Han dynasty of China into a permanent state of near collapse, extorting gold and silk just to buy one more day of peace. These were the proto-Huns, the original blueprint for world destruction, organized into vast lethal confederations that existed purely for war and plunder. Their society was fundamentally allergic to farming and fixed settlements. The Xiongnu believed that true strength came from constant movement, following the herds, utilizing every single part of their environment to become the most self-sufficient, fast-moving military machine the ancient world had yet encountered. Their entire existence was a middle finger raised at the concept of stability. While the great Roman legions were busy perfecting their formations and building straight roads in the west, their counterparts in the east, the Chinese, were facing an existential threat that they could neither defeat in battle nor pacify with diplomacy. The Xiongnu were the ultimate unsolvable problem, a poison dart aimed directly at the heart of settled power. They operated under a highly decentralized, yet brutally efficient military structure, commanded by the Chanyu, the supreme leader, whose power was based entirely on his ability to lead successful raids and maintain the flow of plunder. If the raids stopped, the empire dissolved, creating a volatile system where expansion was the only key to survival. This pressure cooker existence meant that their riders were not just soldiers. They were born in the saddle, capable of shooting accurately backwards at a full gallop, a terrifying tactic that utterly baffled and annihilated the slow-moving, heavily armored infantry of the agricultural kingdoms. Their bows could pierce heavy bronze armor, delivered by an arrow that seemed to materialize out of thin air. For hundreds of years, the relationship between the sedentary civilizations and these swirling masses on the steppe was a perfect, deadly equilibrium of fear and manipulation. China poured unbelievable wealth into tribute payments, effectively funding the very armies dedicated to its destruction, all to maintain a fragile, temporary lull in the slaughter. But the brilliance of the Xiongnu was their sheer adaptability and their terrifying ability to absorb defeated tribes and enemy defectors, constantly refreshing their numbers and adopting new technologies or strategies immediately if they proved effective. They didn't innovate, they simply conquered and consumed innovation. Now, imagine this entire lethal engine, the core of this Xiongnu superorganism, starts to feel the pressure of internal strife, drought, and counterattacks from a momentarily unified Chinese military. The steppe begins to reject its inhabitants, forcing a terrifying exodus. The nomadic empires rarely truly fell. They simply migrated, like a vast, deadly swarm of locusts, moving their overwhelming pressure from one geopolitical zone to another. And when they moved, the world fundamentally changed. The moment the Xiongnu pushed west, they set in motion a chain reaction that would eventually reach the walls of Constantinople and beyond. The invisible barrier that had protected the West was about to shatter. The vast, empty grasslands that separated the settled peoples of Europe from the perpetual chaos of Central Asia suddenly became the highway for the greatest demographic shift the world had ever seen. The engine of doom was starting its journey. We are witnessing, right now, the first domino falling, a chain of events that will eventually put Attila the Hun at the gates of Rome and Genghis Khan across the entire face of the known world. All of it started right here, in the desperate, wind-swept heart of the East, driven by the simple, brutal necessity of survival on the unforgiving steppe. Prepare yourself, because the next movement in this grand, horrifying symphony of history involves the sudden, shattering appearance of the Scythians, the original masters of the horse, whose golden treasures and mysterious, blood-soaked rituals predate even the might of Persia. Their story sets the stage for the true terror to come. If the steppe was the engine of chaos, the Scythians were its first perfect weapon, forged in the relentless winds of the Pontic-Caspian vastness. They didn't just ride horses. They were a biological extension of their mounts, capable of feats of mounted archery that defied the known laws of physics. For the terrified foot soldiers of the settled world, these riders appeared and vanished like mirages, leaving nothing behind but the corpses of their comrades and the metallic scent of fresh blood. They perfected the infamous Parthian shot, or rather the Scythian shot, the impossible maneuver where a rider, seemingly in full retreat, would twist in the saddle and unleash a deadly arrow backward, striking the pursuing enemy directly in the face, a psychological weapon that crippled entire armies before the actual battle even began. They were the masters of the feigned retreat, turning panic into a deadly trap, a terrifying lesson in speed that Europe would relearn centuries later, always too late. And the greatest empire the world had yet seen, the mighty Achaemenid Persia, commanded by Darius the Great, thought they could tame this terror. Darius, the king of kings, marched his colossal army across the Hellespont around 513 BC, intent on crushing the Scythians deep in their heartland, bringing engineers, supply lines, and the unwavering confidence of a ruler who had conquered half the known world. What he found was not a fixed enemy line to break, but an absolute, horrifying emptiness. The Scythians refused to fight a pitched battle, understanding the fatal vulnerability of massive supply lines. They simply burned the grass, poisoned the wells, and retreated deeper and deeper into the endless plains, luring the colossal Persian war machine into a lethal, logistical quicksand. The Scythians had perfected the art of strategic depletion, forcing the invaders to choke on their own ambition. As Darius's army starved, demoralized, and dying of thirst, the nomads would occasionally send the Persian king a cryptic gift: a bird, a mouse, a frog, and 5 arrows. It was a message of utter, mocking doom. The accompanying interpretation, delivered by a messenger with ice in his veins, was chillingly simple. If you, Persians, do not become birds and fly up into the sky, or mice and burrow down into the earth, or frogs and jump into the water, you will not escape these arrows. This was the nomads' declaration of war against the very concept of fixed territory. Darius, realizing the catastrophic futility of his campaign, his army reduced to a staggering, dying mess, was forced into one of the most humiliating retreats in history, abandoning tens of thousands of men to the steppe. This victory cemented the Scythians' reputation as untouchable, the living proof that speed and mobility could defeat sheer industrial mass and fixed fortifications. Their power was secured not by walls, but by terror and constant, dizzying motion. Their culture was just as terrifying as their warcraft. Deep within their colossal burial mounds, the kurgans, archaeologists later uncovered a chilling display of their commitment to the afterlife. These weren't just graves. They were time capsules of a savage majesty, filled with stunning gold artifacts, buckles shaped like leaping stags, plaques depicting mythical griffins locked in eternal combat, all reflecting a belief system rooted in raw, untamed nature and the veneration of the hunt. Alongside the gold lay the evidence of human sacrifice, often involving the strangulation of servants and concubines to accompany the deceased chief, along with hundreds of horses ready to ride into the next world. Their greatest kings were buried with incredible pomp and horrific ritual, ensuring that their power projected into eternity. They drank fermented mare's milk. They inhaled psychoactive cannabis smoke in felt tents, and they treated the settled peoples with contemptuous indifference, seeing them as soft, predictable, and ultimately prey. But the Scythians, for all their golden splendor and tactical genius, were subject to the same unforgiving law of the steppe: perpetual replacement. While they dominated the western Eurasian plains for centuries, their power began to fracture under the sustained pressure of new aggressive waves migrating from the east and north. The Sarmatians, equally skilled in cavalry warfare, but perhaps even heavier and more intimidating with their use of armored cataphracts, gradually pushed the Scythians out of their prime territories. The terrorizers were eventually terrorized, their great empire dissolving into smaller fragments, remnants swallowed by the very land they mastered. By the 2nd century BC, their dominance was effectively over, their legacy reduced to cryptic artifacts and the terrifying memory recorded in Greek and Persian scrolls. The irony is profound. The pioneers of the nomadic war machine were rendered obsolete by an even newer, slightly more efficient version of themselves. The map had been wiped clean in the west, but the fundamental pressure cooker of the steppe remained. Because while the Scythians were busy fighting Persia and Rome's nascent influence, something far more cohesive, far more brutal, and operating on a vastly larger scale was coalescing in the deep heart of Inner Asia. This was the seismic shift that would truly redefine the nature of nomadic terror, forcing the greatest civilization of the East, Imperial China, to confront an existential threat that would dictate its entire history for 2 millennia. The Scythians were the warning shot. The Xiongnu were the apocalypse. We move now eastward, away from the Pontic steppe and across the Siberian taiga to the harsh, dry plateau where modern Mongolia now rests. Here, the very atmosphere was charged with catastrophic intent. The stage is set for the arrival of the Chanyu, the ultimate warlord, and the beginning of the Great Wall's desperate, futile plea for survival. The seismic tremor that the world felt wasn't just a random ripple. It was the arrival of the Xiongnu, galvanized under a single, terrifying will. Forget disorganized raiders. This was the first true military megastructure forged entirely on horseback, a lethal singularity demanding tribute from civilization itself. The moment was defined by one man, whose ascension was painted in the blood of his own kin, Madu Chanyu. By the time Modu was satisfied, he commanded not just soldiers, but automatons, a unified death cult that moved with the terrifying coordination of a single colossal predator. This was the disciplined engine that crashed into the settled world, a catastrophic reversal of fortunes for the newly unified Chinese state. The nascent Han dynasty, proud of its recent centralization, scoffed at the northern dogs, convinced that sheer numbers and fortifications would hold the line. They were catastrophically wrong. The Great Wall, that desperate stone plea for isolation, became merely the starting line for the Xiongnu's brutal agenda. Their warfare was a terrifying ballet of speed, appearing out of nowhere like a dust storm, delivering a crippling volley of arrows that could punch through leather armor, and vanishing before a counterattack could be organized. They carried no baggage train, for their supplies were their herds. Their fuel was the unforgiving steppe. This velocity was the ultimate terror weapon, transforming conflict from a pitched battle into a perpetual, exhausting chase. The most humiliating chapter in Chinese history began shortly after the Han founder, Emperor Gaozu, Liu Bang, decided to personally lead a massive army to confront Modu and end the menace once and for all. He marched 320,000 men deep into Xiongnu territory in the winter of 200 BCE, driven by hubris and the belief that the barbarians would flee the might of the Middle Kingdom. Modu, the master strategist, feigned retreat, luring the colossal Han force, especially the emperor and his vanguard, into a narrow, frozen valley near the city of Pingcheng, known forever after as the Battle of Baideng. It was not a battle, it was an entrapment. 40,000 of the Xiongnu's finest cavalry, their horses clad in thick winter coats, surrounded Gaozu's entire column, sealing them in an icy tomb for 7 agonizing days and nights. This utter humiliation reset the geopolitical map. It was the moment the settled world was forced to admit that the nomads were not just a nuisance, but the dominant power of Asia. The consequence was the infamous Heikin, peace and kinship policy, a treaty that became the ultimate symbol of China's subjugation. The Emperor of China, the Son of Heaven, was forced to acknowledge the Xiongnu Chanyu as an equal, a terrifying brother from the north. Furthermore, China was forced to pay an annual, staggering tribute, massive quantities of the finest silk, vast stores of grain, and most bitterly, a Han princess was sent north every year to marry the Chanyu, securing a bloody, temporary peace with a marital alliance. This flow of wealth wasn't just payment, it was a subsidy that fueled the Xiongnu war machine, allowing Modu to focus his attention elsewhere. With the richest and most powerful nation in Asia paying protection money, Modu consolidated his power across the entire eastern steppe. He systematically crushed rival nomadic groups, the Donghu to the east, the Yuezhi to the west, enslaving their populations and incorporating their warriors into his ever-expanding confederacy. The Xiongnu Empire stretched from the deserts of the Gobi to the fertile plains of Manchuria, an unprecedented expanse of kinetic power. The Xiongnu were a decentralized hierarchy built on terror and mobility, structured around three vast power centers: the Chanyu's central command and the powerful wise kings of the east and west. Though they moved constantly, their power structure was rigid, designed to extract resources efficiently from both their own vassal tribes and the terrified populations south of the wall. For nearly a century, the Han dynasty lived under this oppressive shadow, their mighty armies confined to defensive patrols, their treasury perpetually drained by the annual northern debt. The very purpose of the Great Wall was inverted. It no longer protected the Han from invasion, but instead served as a perpetual, agonizing reminder of their failure and the terrifying, unstoppable force that held the keys to their peace. This was the reign of the Chanyu, the silent, swift terror that dictated the terms of survival for the greatest civilization on Earth, setting the stage for a century of simmering rage that would eventually erupt in a colossal, world-defining war of vengeance. For decades, the Xiongnu Chanyu walked the earth as the undisputed master of the northern world. They had forced the celestial sovereign of the east, the Han Emperor himself, to pay tribute, to send silks, grains, and even princesses as tokens of submission, a deeply embedded state of political blackmail. This was not peace. It was a deeply wounding psychological warfare waged through economics, a constant drain on the Han treasury that served only to underscore who held the true military power on the northern frontier. Every single bolt of expensive silk sent north was a reminder of the humiliation suffered at Beidang decades earlier, a debt stamped in blood that the Han court had silently sworn to repay. The Xiongnu believed they had established a permanent, untouchable dominance, a system where the agricultural South existed merely to feed the kinetic terror of the steppe. They believed the cycle of raid and tribute was eternal, a natural law of the universe. But empires do not forget. They calculate, they stockpile, and when the time was right, a new star rose in the east, a figure so ambitious and so ruthless that he would redefine the very nature of conflict. Emperor Wu of Han. This man, often called the Martial Emperor, ascended the dragon throne not with the intent of managing the Xiongnu threat, but of eradicating it. For him, the steppe was not a defensive border to be guarded. It was a launching pad for true imperial glory, and the Xiongnu were merely the first hurdle that had to be vaporized. Under his relentless command, the Han war machine began a transformation unseen since the unification of the Qin. It was an industrial revolution aimed solely at murder, a decades-long preparation for total war. The critical weakness of the Han had always been cavalry. Xiongnu armies were born on horseback, fighting with an unparalleled agility that slow-moving infantry formations simply couldn't touch, especially in the vast expanse of the north. Emperor Wu's solution was devastatingly simple, yet required impossible resources: breed millions of horses. He demanded the establishment of vast imperial stud farms, protected and subsidized, pouring staggering amounts of state capital into creating an army that could meet the terrifying horsemen of the steppe on their own terms, matching their speed with sheer, crushing numbers. Furthermore, the logistics were redefined. The empire was preparing not for cautious border skirmishes, but for deep strikes thousands of kilometers into hostile territory, a nightmare of supply chain management that stretched the limits of ancient engineering and required an entirely new bureaucratic apparatus dedicated solely to feeding the war machine. They needed an estimated 300,000 men just to manage the supply lines for every major expedition, hauling grain and water across deserts and arid grasslands, proving that in this new kind of warfare, the quartermaster was just as vital as the general. Then came the weapons. Emperor Wu didn't just need soldiers, he needed demigods of war, figures capable of embodying the new, aggressive spirit of the Han dynasty. He found them in two names that still echo across the dust of history: Wei Qing and his nephew, the impossibly young, impossibly brilliant Huo Qubing. These men were the lightning strikes of Han vengeance. They were the embodiment of the new doctrine: aggression, speed, and absolute destruction, moving faster than intelligence could track. The waiting was over. The game had fundamentally changed from weary defense to determined extermination. The first great campaigns were not cautious probes. They were hammer blows designed to shatter the Xiongnu's deeply ingrained sense of invincibility. In 127 BCE, Wei Qing led a devastating assault that seized the fertile Ordos Loop, a critical grazing ground that crippled the Xiongnu's horse breeding capabilities and pushed them dramatically back across the Yellow River bend. This victory was strategic genius, denying the Xiongnu the critical resources they needed to maintain their military population, forcing them to retreat deeper into the unforgiving north. But it was Huo Qubing who wrote the true legend of terror, a general so daring he seemed immune to the laws of military caution. At barely 19 years old, Huo Qubing launched deep penetration raids that defied all known military logic. He didn't just defeat Xiongnu tribes in set-piece battles, he ran them down to their last breath across impossible distances, proving that the steppe was no longer a sanctuary. His most famous campaigns targeted the Hexi Corridor, the vital artery connecting China to the west. In a series of breathtaking maneuvers, Huo Qubing drove 2,000 li, over 800 kilometers, into enemy territory, obliterating two major Xiongnu princes and capturing the sacred Golden Man statues, a massive religious and psychological blow. The psychological impact was ruinous. The Xiongnu, who relied on the element of surprise and the sheer vastness of the territory to melt away and evade pursuit, now faced an enemy that was faster, better supplied, and utterly relentless in its pursuit. The terror they had inflicted for decades was suddenly turned back upon them, magnified tenfold by the speed of their young nemesis. The year 1119 BCE marked the climax, the decisive battle in the Gobi Desert. A massive two-pronged Han force, nearly 100,000 cavalry strong, pushed north into the scorching, empty heart of the steppe to finally confront the Xiongnu Chanyu directly and settle the score once and all. Wei Qing's column fought a brutal, blinding battle against the Xiongnu main force, using heavy siege wagons to break the wind and dust storms that had previously protected the nomads, eventually scattering the Chanyu northward in disarray. The Xiongnu were broken, not just defeated, but fundamentally shattered. Their confederacy, once an iron fist, splintered into factions seeking survival, either by submitting to the now triumphant Han dynasty or by fleeing further west into the unknown darkness of Central Asia. This was the turning point that reset the clock of history. The Han dynasty had not merely won a war, they had fundamentally altered the geopolitical balance of the entire known world. They had taken the engine of chaos, the unstoppable horseman, and for the first time in history, they had stopped it dead in its tracks. The cost was astronomical. The state coffers bled dry by the massive logistics train and the decades of warfare. But the result was definitive. The steppe threat was neutralized, and the trade routes to the west, the legendary Silk Road, finally lay open for exploitation. The ghost of Baideng was finally exorcised, but the true history of the nomads was only just beginning, as the broken pieces of the Xiongnu Empire began their terrifying migration, carrying their rage and their incomparable military skills into the unsuspecting lands of the West, a future threat waiting to erupt centuries later. The ground didn't just shake when the Xiongnu turned their back on the east. It cracked. It was a geopolitical fault line opening up. But the earth-shattering reality was that the massive, centralized power of the Xiongnu Confederacy, the first true steppe superpower, was finally being broken by the unrelenting, resource-devouring machine known as the Han Dynasty. The centuries-long dance of death between the farmer and the horseman had reached a sickening, pivotal climax. Imagine the sheer, unimaginable cost of this war. The Han, under emperors like Wu, and later the generals who perfected the art of deep-strike cavalry warfare, mobilized forces that dwarfed anything the ancient world had ever seen, pushing their supply lines past the breaking point just to reach the enemy's heartland. They weren't just fighting battles. They were engaging in an existential war of attrition designed to choke the steppe economy to death. disrupting the essential trade routes and forcing the nomads into increasingly desperate maneuvers. This wasn't merely about protecting the Great Wall. It was about destroying the concept of a unified nomadic threat forever. The Xiongnu, resilient and terrifying as always, absorbed the blows, but even the greatest warrior culture can only endure so much political intrigue and constant military pressure. The internal stresses became too great, the succession disputes too poisonous, and the pressure from the Hans' endless supply of manpower and metal finally caused a catastrophic fissure in the very soul of the Confederacy. It wasn't a military defeat that ended the golden age of the Xiongnu. Not entirely. It was a political implosion, a schism born of desperation and divergent strategies. Suddenly, the world watched in stunned silence as the Xiongnu split, dramatically and irrevocably, into two distinct, warring halves, the southern Xiongnu and the northern Xiongnu. The southern faction, exhausted and recognizing the brutal reality of Han superiority, chose the path of vassalage. They swore fealty to the mighty Han Emperor, agreeing to serve as border guards and auxiliary forces, a poisoned choice that bought them survival but cost them their independence and, arguably, their honor. But the northern Xiongnu, the true inheritors of the terrifying legacy, the proud core who refused to bow, they retreated, but they did not surrender. They packed up their entire world, their herds, their families, and their boundless fury, pushing further into the arid, unforgiving Siberian wastes, seeking refuge from the relentless pursuit of the Han armies. The Han generals, realizing they had fractured the monster but not killed it, launched a terrifying series of deep, punitive expeditions into the north. General Dao Xian, a name that should echo with geological force, led the final, crushing blow in 89 CE, shattering the northern Xiongnu in the Battle of the Altai Mountains. This was the moment history pivoted. Defeated, dispersed, and fundamentally homeless, the remnants of the northern Xiongnu were forced to make the ultimate, fateful decision. They had to go west. There was nothing left for them in the east but the shadow of the Han Empire and the rising tide of new, smaller nomadic groups who eagerly took their place, scavenging the scraps of the fallen giant. Imagine the procession, thousands upon thousands of riders, their entire social structure intact, carrying the knowledge of statecraft, the perfected composite bow, and a millennium of accumulated martial hatred, all focused like a burning lens toward the setting sun. They were not refugees. They were a displaced military culture, an engine of destruction seeking new fuel. They moved across Central Asia, across the vast, inhospitable lands that separated the settled worlds of China and Rome. For centuries, they were a ghost, an unstoppable legend passing through the fragmented kingdoms of the Tarim Basin and the warring tribes of Sogdiana, terrifying everyone they met, but never stopping. They absorbed new tribes, intermingled their bloodlines, changed their names, and slightly altered their tactics, but the core essence remained: the Xiongnu DNA of rapid, overwhelming, state-level nomadic warfare. The history books record them next, centuries later, emerging from the mist like a nightmare given flesh, thousands of miles from their origin. These were the people who would eventually arrive at the doorstep of Europe, a sudden, terrifying apparition that seemed to spring fully formed from the abyssal darkness beyond the Volga River. They had traveled the length of the earth, driven by a single, powerful impulse, the need to escape the shadow of the Han dynasty. The Han thought they had solved the problem, perhaps congratulating themselves for having exiled the menace forever. They had paid an incredible price. Their own empire was already showing the deep cracks of internal exhaustion and overextension required to fight such a foe. But they believed the steppe was pacified. They were wrong. They hadn't defeated the force. They had merely redirected it. They had bottled up the fury of the Asian steppe and aimed it like a loaded cannon directly at the fragile, civilized heart of the Roman world, a world utterly unprepared for the sheer velocity and terror of the riders now riding inexorably toward them. The ghost of the Xiongnu, having walked across the entire map, was about to receive a new legendary name, a name that would freeze the blood of every European peasant and king for 1,000 years: the Huns. But before the Huns could arrive, the vacuum left in the east needed to be filled, and a next great wave of Asian terror was already beginning to form in the shattered homeland of the Xiongnu. The steppe does not tolerate emptiness. The moment the colossal Xiongnu Empire fractured and dissolved into the dust of historical memory, the earth itself seemed to heave, spawning dozens of smaller, hungrier tribes ready to seize the vacant throne of terror. These were the opportunists, the inheritors, the ones who learned the dark, brutal lessons of mobile warfare from the giants they had just helped topple. But amidst this chaotic dust storm, one group coalesced with terrifying, swift efficiency, ready to fill the vacuum of power left behind in the east, the Xianbei. They emerged from the eastern fringes, initially vassals, now masters, inheriting not just the tools and territories of the Xiongnu, but their ultimate existential ambition to dominate the agricultural world. They were faster, arguably more adaptable, and definitely crueler. Seeing the deeply fractured state of China proper, now exhausted by the late Han dynasty's collapse and subsequent civil wars, not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as a colossal, undefended feast laid out for the taking. China was utterly unprepared for this new breed of relentless, opportunistic devastation. Their rise was less the creation of a unified, singular empire, and more a sudden, devastating infestation, a plague of mounted thunder that descended upon the crumbling northern heartlands with zero warning. They did not seek tribute. They sought total control, total replacement, and total destruction of the old order. What followed was a period known in Chinese history whispered still in terrified tones as the 16 Kingdoms period, or perhaps more accurately, the Age of Steppe Annihilation. It was not 16 stable, predictable kingdoms, but a century of ever-shifting chaos, where dozens of short-lived dynasties, most founded by Xianbei, Di, Ji, and other non-Han nomadic groups, ripped the agricultural core out of northern China.
Cities fell in weeks. Entire populations were massacred, enslaved or displaced in vast forced marches, and the very concept of stable, unified civilization retreated south across the mighty Yangtze River, barricading itself against the unstoppable northern tide. The psychological damage alone was generational, rewriting the demographic map of the entire region.
Imagine a world where every single day brings a new warlord, riding in on horseback, demanding total subservience, backed by the threat of immediate, absolute eradication. The Xianbei, specifically, splintered into powerful, aggressive clans, the Murong, the Tuaba, each vying for supreme dominance over the rich, irreplaceable farmlands they now controlled. They transitioned from being mere raiders to being conquerors, determined to settle and rule. Yet they fiercely retained the raw, primal ferocity and mobility of the steppe warrior, marrying bureaucratic cunning with unmatched martial skill. The most successful, the most cunning, and ultimately the longest-lasting of these Xianbei splinter groups were the Tuaba. They did not just raid, they meticulously observed, studied, and mastered the complex Chinese administrative techniques they initially despised, weaving the rigid, necessary structure of settled life with the fluid, kinetic power of the nomad. This painful, brutal transformation was essential for their survival in the cutthroat, fractured landscape of the shattered north. The Tuoba established the Northern Wei dynasty, a massive, armored sentinel that stood guarding the Yellow River heartland, successfully unifying the northern territories under a single, albeit foreign, rule. But even as they settled, adopted agriculture, and built palaces, they never truly forgot the brutal lessons of the open plains. Their armies remained overwhelmingly cavalry-based, their tactics emphasizing terrifying speed, instantaneous maneuverability, and the earth-shattering momentum of the mounted charge, ensuring that the steppe spirit still pulsed aggressively beneath the silk robes of their imperial courts. The transformation was complete, but the aggression remained. Why does this immense eastern catastrophe matter to the wider world? Because, while the Xianbei were busy dismantling China's north, occupying the great historical enemy, they inadvertently put immense, unprecedented existential pressure on everyone else living on the steppe fringes. The sheer mass of nomadic movement they generated, pushing millions of people off traditional grazing lands, acted like a massive, unstoppable atmospheric pressure system originating in the east. This forced migration wasn't random or gentle. It was directed, a terrifying, catastrophic chain reaction set off by the rise of the Tuaba Wei and their consolidation of power. Imagine a vast billiard table representing the Eurasian landmass, hit the ball on the far left, the Xiongnu. Shanbei collision, and the ball on the far right starts moving, gaining speed, gaining terrifying historical momentum. This was the ultimate geopolitical domino effect, caused by the ancient, merciless cycle of steppe conquest. And what was that far-right ball, accelerating across the vastness of Central Asia and destined for the pampered luxury of the Roman world? It was the final, devastating echo of the Xiongnu diaspora, refined, hardened, and now coalescing into its most terrifying, infamous form, the tribe that history would forever remember as the Huns. We are now standing directly on the doorstep of the West's greatest, most spectacular nightmare. The Huns were not a sudden creation. They were the ghost of the Xiongnu, refined and reforged in the fires of generations of Central Asian migration, driven westward by the very chaos the Xianbei were so successfully institutionalizing back in China. They spent decades traversing immense distances, absorbing new peoples, adopting new tactics, and perfecting their signature weapon, the composite recurve bow, delivered from horseback with blinding speed and terrifying precision. They first appeared like phantoms to the settled peoples of the Volga region, specifically the powerful Alans, who were utterly annihilated or swiftly incorporated into the growing, unstoppable horde. This was the first seismic tremor that reached the Mediterranean world, a distant, terrifying rumor of an inhuman enemy that traveled faster than any army could muster, hitting like a tidal wave and disappearing just as quickly. The Romans, already struggling with the Goths and Vandals pressing against their borders, foolishly dismissed these early reports as mere barbarian exaggeration, the ravings of frightened frontier tribes. They thought they had seen true nomadic terror before. They were catastrophically wrong. They had only seen the warm-up act. The arrival of the Huns didn't just push existing barbarians into the Roman Empire, it compressed them, forcing millions of people, Goths, Sarmatians, Suebi, Vandals, into a desperate, suicidal stampede across the Danube frontier, overwhelming every single defensive barrier the Romans had erected. It was the ultimate, horrifying consequence of the steppe's eternal, cyclical war, finally arriving at the gates of the West, borne on the backs of thousands of tireless, terrifying horsemen. The ultimate, horrifying consequence had arrived, and the first victims were not the Romans, but the very people Rome had struggled to contain for centuries, the Visigoths. These warrior tribes, massive and fearsome in their own right, suddenly found themselves staring into a void of pure equestrian terror, realizing that their localized cruelty was child's play compared to the storm brewing in the east. They were not defeated in pitched battles. They were simply dissolved, their society collapsing under the relentless psychological pressure of an enemy that moved like lightning and vanished like mist, leaving only scorched earth and despair in its wake. This mass displacement, this panic-driven stampede, pushed the Gothic refugees directly onto the Roman frontier along the mighty Danube River, demanding entry, begging for sanctuary from the unstoppable Hunnic engine. And Rome, arrogant and blind to the true scale of the catastrophe, agreed to let them in, hoping to absorb them as farmers and soldiers, but treating them with such profound administrative ineptitude and outright corruption that the starved, desperate Goths quickly rose up in rebellion. It was a self-inflicted wound, born of greed and miscalculation. But the true puppet master was the unseen pressure of the Huns just beyond the horizon, forcing this collision course with deadly precision. The stage was set for one of the most catastrophic single events in Roman military history, the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, a date that should echo in the annals of doom forever. This wasn't merely a defeat. It was the moment the Roman Empire fundamentally lost faith in its own military superiority. Emperor Valens, brimming with misplaced confidence and eager to claim all the glory for himself, refused to wait for the crucial reinforcements promised by his co-emperor Gratian. He marched his massive eastern field army straight into Thrace, confident that his disciplined legions could easily crush the unruly, disorganized Goths who had dared to challenge the Pax Romana. What he failed to account for was the sheer desperation of his enemy, and perhaps the lingering shadow of the Hunnic tactics that the Goths had quickly and violently adapted in their flight, prioritizing mobile shock cavalry over static infantry lines, a tactical evolution forced by terror itself. The Eastern Army was annihilated, its backbone broken, its commanders dead, and its morale permanently scarred, proving once and for all that the ancient methodologies of Rome were fundamentally incapable of dealing with the new kinetic warfare forged in the furnaces of the Eurasian steppe. The very concept of the disciplined Roman square was rendered obsolete by the speed of the horse archer. But the Huns were not yet ready to claim the stage directly. They were the great amplifier, the force multiplier, that ensured Rome could never truly recover its footing. Yet they remained, for a time, content to operate in the shadows, consolidating their own power base, far from the immediate sight of the shattered imperial courts. They began their slow, terrifying pivot from mere raiders and disruptors to true political players, using their overwhelming military superiority as a bargaining chip, selling their services to the highest bidder in the endless, fracturing civil wars of the West and East. They became the ultimate mercenaries, demanding gold, demanding land, demanding tribute, essentially leasing their terror to the dying Roman state, making them complicit in their own ruin. This transition was critical. The Huns moved into the vast, fertile plains of Pannonia, establishing a new, central power structure, a logistical hub from which they could project their power north, south, east, and west with staggering efficiency, forming a colossal war machine in the geographical heart of Europe. They were no longer simply hitting and running. They were settling in the most unstable, frightening way possible, planting a flag of pure nomad aggression right in the soft center of Central Europe. The Romans, paralyzed by their own internal strife and reeling from the Adrianople shockwave, tried desperately to appease them, offering massive annual subsidies in exchange for peace, which was nothing more than a thinly veiled protection racket that cost the imperial treasury astronomical sums every single year. Every sack of gold sent across the Danube only reinforced the fundamental truth. The empire was paying its own executioner to wait politely outside the door, hoping against all reason that the butcher would simply forget why he was there. And as the decades turned, this massive, decentralized force of disparate Hunnic clans and subjugated Germanic peoples began to coalesce, drawn together by the irresistible gravitational pull of a single, terrifying personality. A man who did not merely lead men, but commanded the very elements of destruction. A figure whose name would become synonymous with dread across 3 continents, whose very existence would define the final agonizing gasp of the Western Roman Empire. The very air around him seemed charged with impending doom, a prophecy fulfilled in flesh and blood. The stage was being cleared of all lesser players. The nomadic storm was focusing, channeling its immense chaotic energy into a single, terrifying spearhead, ready to pierce the rotten core of European civilization, threatening to erase 2,000 years of urban development in a single, fiery campaign. The world held its breath, waiting for the arrival of the ultimate, prophesized scourge, the one known simply, chillingly, and forever as the Scourge of God, Attila. The air itself cracked with the sheer weight of Attila's destiny. He wasn't just inheriting the Hunnic war machine. He was refining it into a perfect instrument of terror, using diplomacy not as a pathway to peace, but as a sophisticated form of global extortion. The Eastern Roman Empire, Constantinople, was utterly paralyzed, forced into a humiliating tributary status that bled their imperial coffers dry, a staggering 700 pounds of gold annually at its peak, simply for the privilege of not being invaded by the horsemen of the apocalypse. This was not negotiation. This was tribute paid to the natural disaster looming on their doorstep. Imagine the shame, the seismic shudder running through the marble halls, knowing that the mightiest empire the world had ever known was reduced to an ATM for a barbarian chieftain whose very name meant ruin. But Attila was no mere chief. He was a strategist who understood the psychology of fear better than any philosopher, realizing that true power lay in the threat of force, making the actual invasion almost secondary. The Huns, under his command, were not merely raiding parties. They were a logistical nightmare for the civilized world, capable of disappearing into the vast Hungarian plains and reappearing thousands of miles away with impossible speed. Their composite bows, the terrifying, asymmetrical weapons of the steppe, could pierce armor at ranges that bewildered Roman legions accustomed to close quarters combat. But the East was merely a piggy bank to be shaken. Attila's true, terrifying ambition was aimed west, toward the tottering, decadent heart of the Western Roman Empire. The narrative needed a spark, a justification for the coming storm, and history, ever dramatic, delivered it in the form of a forgotten, desperate princess. Her name was Honoria, the sister of the Western Emperor Valentinian III. Trapped in a life of gilded misery and political maneuvering, she made the most audacious, reckless plea in history. She sent her ring, secretly, across the Danube and the Rhine, offering her hand in marriage to the scourge of God himself, Attila. Attila received this symbolic proposal and seized upon it like a starving wolf. He didn't care for the princess, but he demanded her dowry, half of the entire Western Roman Empire. This was the casus belli, the flimsy, glittering excuse he needed to unleash the full fury of the steppe upon Gaul, modern-day France, the last bastion of Roman strength in the West. In 451 A.D., the invasion began, a deluge of horseflesh and fire that swept across the Rhine, obliterating everything in its path. Cities like Metz were reduced to smoking rubble. The very ground seemed to tremble under the millions of hooves. It was a race against oblivion, and the only man capable of facing this apocalyptic tide was Flavius Aetius, the last great Roman general, a man whose own life was a strange, tangled reflection of the barbarian world he fought. Aetius was called the last of the Romans, but ironically, he had grown up as a hostage among the Huns themselves. He knew their language, their tactics, and even their brutal nomadic hearts. He was the only person alive who understood Attila, having once been his friend, perhaps even his ally. This was the ultimate betrayal waiting to happen, former comrades destined to clash for the fate of civilization. Aetius knew he could not defeat Attila with Roman forces alone. Rome was too weak, too fractured. He had to construct the most bizarre, fragile alliance history had ever seen, joining forces with the very Visigoths, the barbarian kingdom established in Gaul, whom Rome had spent centuries fighting and fearing. King Theodoric I, the great Gothic warlord, saw the existential threat posed by the Huns and reluctantly joined the Roman banner. This was the world turning upside down. The Romans and the Goths, the eternal enemies, stood side by side, preparing for the final showdown against the ultimate enemy of mankind. The two armies converged in the open fields of Gaul, a vast, flat expanse near modern Chalons and Champagne, known to history as the Catalaunian Plains. This was not a battle for territory. It was a struggle for the soul of the future, a collision between the old world and the terrifying kinetic force of the steppe. Attila positioned his forces on a crucial high ground, but Aetius, maneuvering with desperate brilliance, managed to seize the ridge first,
The battle devolved into a chaotic, screaming maelstrom of cavalry charges, infantry formations breaking, and the horrifying whistling sound of Hunnic arrows raining down like deadly hail.
The turning point came when Theodoric I, the Visigoth king, was killed, falling from his horse and trampled in the horrific melee. His son, Thorismund, galvanized by rage and the sight of his father's death, surged forward, leading a charge that fractured the Hunnic center, driving Attila back into his massive, wagon-fortified camp. The year is 452 AD, and the air itself tasted of impending doom. Attila the Hun, the undisputed master of the steppe, had gathered his forces, not for some meaningless skirmish on the Danube, but for the jugular of the Western Roman world, Italy itself. The great Alps, once believed to be an insurmountable fortress wall, became nothing more than a minor speed bump for the furious tide of horsemen pouring down into the fertile Po Valley. The fear was a physical entity, heavy and cold, settling upon every Roman heart. Because this was not war. This was the reckoning that had been promised for a century. Cities that had stood proudly since the Republic crumbled into dust in days. Aquileia, the magnificent gateway to the north, a hub of trade and Roman resilience, was surrounded, besieged, and then utterly wiped from the map with a savagery that stunned the ancient world. They didn't just conquer it, they erased it, leaving behind such a scene of carnage that historians claim the site was literally overgrown and forgotten for generations, a grim monument to the ferocity of the scourge. The road to Rome was now wide open, paved only by the ashes of the destroyed cities and the fleeing populace. The Emperor Valentinian III, a ghost of Roman strength, was paralyzed by fear, hiding behind the walls of Ravenna, unable or unwilling to meet the scourge in open battle, clinging to the fading illusion of imperial power. There was no army left, not after the drain of civil wars and the disastrous losses that had characterized the preceding decade. All that stood between the relentless fury of the Hun and the eternal city, the capital of history, the spiritual center of the West, was a desperate gamble, an act of faith, or perhaps pure, blind luck. They sent out not generals and legions, not the iron might of Rome's past, but a delegation of robed priests and politicians, led by the formidable Bishop of Rome, Pope Leo I. Imagine the scene. The man who claimed spiritual authority over the known world, riding out across the desolate, smoke-filled plains, straight into the camp of the man who claimed ultimate physical authority over the known world. It was a confrontation of two utterly opposed types of power, a meeting that should have ended in immediate massacre, but instead became one of the great historical mysteries, a silence pregnant with the fate of millions. What words were spoken under the shadow of the Hunnic banners?
Did Leo I truly possess a divine charisma so powerful it stayed the hand of the greatest destroyer the world had yet known? Or were there more earthly, pragmatic concerns whispering in Attila's ear, concerns that spoke louder than the promise of Roman gold?
The contemporary sources, steeped in Roman bias, claimed it was a miracle. The spectral vision of Saint Peter and Saint Paul standing beside the Pope, threatening Attila with immediate divine retribution if he dared touch the holy city. But the brutal reality of logistics offers a colder, more logical explanation for this shocking pause in destruction. Attila's army, though terrifying in its speed, was far from home, deep in hostile territory, and already suffering from the inevitable exhaustion and plague that followed rapid conquest. The supplies were thin, the rivers were running high, swollen by spring rains, and the hot Italian summer was beginning to decimate his cavalry, who struggled in the oppressive heat and humidity of the Po marshes, far from the dry steppe grasslands they called home. To take Rome would have been glorious, yes, a fulfillment of 1,000 years of nomadic dreaming, but to hold it against the inevitable internal uprising while managing a supply line stretching back across the entire European continent, that was a logistical nightmare even for the scourge of God.
Attila accepted the massive tribute offered by the desperate Romans, turned his back on the richest prize in the West, and retreated back across the Danube, leaving Italy shaking but somehow intact, believing they had witnessed divine intervention, a pause in the engine of fate. But the greatest terror of the steppe empires was never their strength. It was their utter dependence on a singular personality. As long as Attila lived, the empire was a unified, unstoppable force of nature. The moment he died, it instantly dissolved into dust.
They buried him in secret, enacting a ritualistic sacrifice of secrecy, diverting a river, interring him in a series of nested coffins, gold, silver, iron, along with untold treasures and the bodies of those who dug the grave, ensuring no one would ever find the resting place of the scourge of God. The secret was preserved by death. His sons, none possessing the horrifying charisma or sheer political gravity of their father, immediately fell into a vicious civil war over the division of the spoils. This was the moment the subject peoples, the Goths, the Gepids, the Suebi, who had been crushed under the Hunnic yoke for generations, had waited for, praying for a sign of weakness. They rose up simultaneously, a massive, coordinated tidal wave of vengeance, fueled by decades of suppressed hatred.
The decisive battle, fought in 454 AD at Nadao, was not a Roman victory, but a victory of the enslaved over their masters. The vast, terror-inducing empire of the Huns, which had dominated Europe for 80 years and defined the catastrophic end of the Roman West, shattered into pieces, never to coalesce again. The Huns scattered, some merging into newer groups, others vanishing into the Balkan mists, proving the immutable law of the steppe. Power built by one man's fury will evaporate the instant that fury is extinguished. The world was reset, but the engine of chaos was merely cooling down. The Huns had shown the way. Now the next generation of steppe riders, tougher, faster, and utterly fearless, was already massing in the east, learning the lessons of rapid conquest and even more rapid dissolution, preparing for the next terrifying turn of the cycle.